If God himself stood before your wedding altar and united you in marriage, why does your home now feel like a battlefield? Why does the sound of his footsteps make your stomach tighten before he even opens the door? Why do your children sit through dinner in silence, looking down at their plates, afraid to say the wrong thing in front of either of you? Padre Pio was asked this exact question by a woman who had been married in the church for 23 years. A woman who had done every single thing right. And what he told her in that confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo changed the way thousands of Catholics would come to understand marriage, family, and the mystery of generational suffering forever. She had done everything right. She was married in holy matrimony, before God, in a church full of people who loved her. She attended Mass every Sunday without fail. She prayed the rosary on her knees every evening. She had raised her children in the faith. And yet her home had become something she could barely recognize when she stopped to look at it honestly. Her husband had grown distant in a way that felt permanent. Her children had begun leaving the faith one by one, and she herself was waking at 3 a.m. with a weight on her chest she had no words for, lying in the dark beside a man who felt more like a stranger with every passing year. When she finally made the journey to San Giovanni Rotondo to confess to Padre Pio, she waited in line for 3 days. 3 days in the cold, praying, preparing, rehearsing what she would say. And when she finally knelt before him in that small confessional, before she could open her mouth to speak a single word, Padre Pio looked at her with those dark, penetrating eyes and said quietly, "You already know what went wrong. The question is whether you have the courage to admit it." Stay with me, because what Padre Pio revealed about Christian marriages in that confessional and in hundreds of others like it over his decades as a confessor is something the Church rarely discusses openly from the pulpit. And it may be the most important thing you hear about your own family today. I'm going to tell you something that most marriage counselors, even faithful Catholic ones, have never told you. There is a spiritual dynamic at work inside every Christian home that almost nobody speaks about plainly. It is not about communication styles. It is not about financial stress. It is not even about compatibility or temperament or any of the things that fill the pages of books about marriage. It is about something Padre Pio called the wound that passes, a generational wound that travels silently from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, hiding behind smiles at Sunday Mass, lurking beneath the rosaries on bedroom walls, poisoning the very love that was supposed to grow stronger under God's blessing, a wound so familiar that the people carrying it have stopped recognizing it as a wound at all. They think it is simply the shape of love. They think this is what love looks like. They do not realize that what they are calling love is a carefully inherited pattern of pain. I have spent years studying Padre Pio's teachings on marriage and family life. I have read the testimonies, the letters, the accounts of his spiritual children, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, the reason so many Catholic marriages are silently dying is not because God abandoned them. It is because something was brought into that marriage that was never surrendered to God. Something old, something inherited, something that does not appear in the wedding photographs but shows up in every argument, in every silence, in every moment of unexplained coldness between two people who genuinely love each other and cannot understand why that love is not enough. Let me tell you something most people do not realize. Something I had to learn the hard way myself, sitting in a small kitchen in Coventry with a cup of tea going cold. The blessing of a sacramental marriage does not automatically erase what two broken people bring to the altar. God honors the sacrament, but the people inside the sacrament are still people, still wounded, still carrying everything their families placed inside them before they were old enough to recognize what was happening. Padre Pio understood this better than almost any confessor who has ever lived. He saw it with his own eyes, week after week, year after year, in confession after confession. And today, I am going to share what he discovered. Now let me tell you about a family. Not one specific family, but a pattern. A generational pattern that Padre Pio described seeing across hundreds of confessions, a pattern so consistent, so precisely repeated across different families, different countries, different centuries, that he eventually told his spiritual director, "The sins of the fathers are not merely a biblical expression. I see them walking into my confessional wearing the faces of the children." It begins with a grandfather. We will call him Antonio. A devout Catholic by every external measure. He attended Mass. He provided for his family. He recited his prayers. But in his heart, he carried a wound he had never once brought to confession. A wound of emotional distance, of the belief absorbed from his own father that a man demonstrates love through provision and correction, not through tenderness and presence. That to show vulnerability is weakness. That the head of the house does not apologize because apologizing is an admission of failure, and a man who fails his family is no man at all. He had learned this silently, by watching, and it had never once occurred to him that it was not simply the truth about manhood. It felt like the truth. It felt like strength. Antonio married a good woman. They had 5 children. To everyone who saw them at Sunday Mass, they were a fine Catholic family. But inside that home, there was a coldness that the children absorbed without words, without explanation, without anyone ever naming it. A silence at the dinner table that felt heavier than any argument could have been. A mother who prayed more desperately each year. A father whose love, though genuine, was expressed entirely through what he built and provided, and never through the words "I was wrong," or "I see you," or "Tell me what you are carrying." He would have given his life for his family. He would not have said "I'm sorry." That wound passed on. His eldest son, Marco, grew up knowing how to work and knowing how to control. He married a woman from a similar home, because souls in pain tend to find each other, not out of carelessness, but out of recognition. Her silence felt familiar. Her endurance felt like strength. They were married in the church. They attended Mass. And within 5 years, their home had the same quality of heaviness, the same unspoken distances, the same children growing up confused about why the house felt like something was always slightly wrong without anyone being able to say what it was. Their children grew up. Some of them left the church. One of them, a woman named Elena, ended up in Padre Pio's confession line at the age of 38, her marriage crumbling, her children drifting, her rosary worn thin from years of desperate prayer, not knowing why nothing was changing. This is what truly matters. Elena did not create the problem. She inherited it. She had been handed a wound she never agreed to carry. And the tragedy, the deep spiritual tragedy that Padre Pio wept over in that confessional, was that she did not know it. She had spent 38 years believing the wound was simply the shape of the world. Hold on. Because what Padre Pio said to Elena when she knelt before him changes everything we think we know about why good Catholic marriages fail. Because he did not condemn her. He did not give her a list of sins to confess. He asked her a question she was not prepared for, and that question opened a door she had kept shut her entire life. Before she could begin her prepared confession, Padre Pio looked at her and said quietly and without judgment, "Before you tell me your sins, tell me about your father." She was startled. Her father was not why she was here. Her father was a good man, a Catholic man. He had gone to Mass his entire life. She said, "He was a good man." "I know he was," Padre Pio replied. "And what did his silence teach you?" That question broke something open in Elena that she had been holding tightly sealed for nearly 4 decades, because her father's silence had taught her something. It had taught her that love is demonstrated through endurance, that a good Catholic woman does not complain, that you carry your cross without asking anyone to help you carry it, that suffering in silence is somehow holier, somehow more spiritually worthy than crying out, that if you simply pray harder, endure more gracefully, and never ask for too much, God will eventually fix the things that are broken. And she had married a man exactly like her father. Not because she was weak, not because she lacked discernment, but because that pattern felt like home. It felt familiar. It felt on some wordless and bone-deep level like what love was supposed to look like. Padre Pio had seen this 1,000 times. The daughters of emotionally absent men marrying emotionally absent men. The sons of controlling mothers becoming controllers. The children of martyrs marrying people who needed martyrs. Not out of malice, not even out of confusion, but out of recognition. The soul navigates toward what it already knows, even when what it knows is slowly wounding it, because the familiar feels safer than the unknown, even when the familiar is pain. Now here is where Padre Pio's teaching becomes something no one had warned Elena about, because he did not stop at the diagnosis. He told her something was happening in her own home at that very moment, something involving her eldest daughter, something Elena had been praying about for over a year without understanding what was actually happening beneath the surface. Her daughter Maria was 20 years old and in a relationship with a young man the family did not approve of. Elena had been begging God to remove this young man from Maria's life. She had been praying novenas. She had been lighting candles. She had been doing everything a desperate Catholic mother knows how to do. Has she left him? Elena asked. She has not left him, Padre Pio said. But that is not the issue. The issue is why she chose him. And then he said something Elena would repeat for the rest of her life, something she would eventually share with her own children and grandchildren, something that would become the turning point of her family's story. She chose him because she is looking for the warmth she never received at home. She is trying to fill an old wound with a young man who carries the same wound. Two people who have not yet faced their own pain do not heal each other. They confirm each other in it. Elena sat in that confessional for a long time after Padre Pio finished speaking. She did not say much. There was not much to say. She had come prepared to confess a list of failings. What she left with was an understanding of why the failing existed in the first place. She returned home and spent a week in prayer and painful honesty. She spoke to her daughter differently. She stopped lecturing and started listening. She said words to Maria that she had never said to anyone in her life, words she had never learned to say because no one in her family had ever said them. I see you. I am sorry for the times I made you feel invisible. I love you not for what you accomplish or how you behave, but for who you are. Maria did not transform overnight. Families never do. But something shifted, something real and permanent shifted beneath the surface, and anyone who has experienced it knows the feeling. A slight but unmistakable loosening, as though a door that has been sealed for years has opened just enough to let air through. This is what Padre Pio understood about the generational wound that most of us miss entirely. It does not end with sacramental confession alone. Confession removes the guilt. The absolution is real, the grace is real, the spiritual cleansing is real. But the pattern must still be actively broken. It must be named. It must be spoken aloud in the family, between the people who carry it. It must be offered to God as a deliberate surrender. This wound ends here, with this generation, in this marriage, in this home. I have experienced this myself, and I say this not to make myself the center of the story, but because I believe concrete testimony is more useful than abstract teaching. There came a day when I looked at my husband and I said, with more vulnerability than I had ever shown another human being, I think I have been repeating something my mother taught me without knowing it, and I want it to stop. That conversation was the hardest conversation we had ever had. It was also the most important one, because it was the first time we stopped speaking to each other's surfaces and started speaking to each other's actual hearts. Here is the insight that changes everything. The insight that Padre Pio offered to a visiting priest who asked him a theological question that had troubled the priest for years. The priest asked, "Why do sacramental marriages fail? If God is genuinely present in the sacrament, if the grace of the sacrament is real and inexhaustible, how can a marriage that began before God collapse into something so bitter and cold?" And Padre Pio answered with something the priest wrote down that evening and kept for the rest of his life. God is present in the sacrament, but the people inside the sacrament are also present. God does not override human freedom. He does not force the heart open. What the sacrament does is hold open the door of grace permanently, wider than any human strength could hold it, so that whenever the two people inside it choose to walk through, the grace is waiting. The sacrament never runs out. But someone must choose to walk through the door, and that choice must be made not once at the altar, but every single day. The door of grace is always open in a Catholic marriage, even when the home feels like a living hell, even when the silences have lasted for years, even when two people are sleeping in the same bed with the same distance between them as if they were in separate countries. The door is open. The grace is waiting. The question that Padre Pio asked, the question he asked of every struggling couple who knelt before him, was simply, "Are you willing to walk through it?" But here is where Padre Pio's teaching on marriage becomes truly unsettling, the part that most people are not prepared to hear, because he did not only warn about the wounds we inherit unconsciously, he warned with great specificity about the wounds we actively choose to keep, the deliberate silences, the refusal to be the first one to extend grace, the small daily cruelties disguised as dignity, as self-respect, as simply not being willing to be taken for granted anymore. 3 people came to Padre Pio in the same month with the same complaint. Their marriages were dead, their homes were cold. They had tried, they had prayed. Nothing was changing. And Padre Pio, to each of these 3 people, said the same thing with the same quiet directness. "You are the one keeping it cold." The first person was a husband, a genuinely good man by every external measure, faithful, hard-working, present in the home. He attended Mass, he said his prayers, he had never been unfaithful to his wife. But in his marriage, he had one weapon he used consistently and without recognizing it as a weapon: silence. When his wife angered him, when she said something that wounded his pride or questioned his judgment, he did not shout. He did not argue. He simply disappeared into himself for hours, sometimes for days. He moved through the house as though she were not there. He answered her questions with the minimum number of words necessary, and he called this keeping the peace. He was proud of it, actually. He considered himself a controlled and disciplined man. Padre Pio told him, "You are using silence as a blade. You believe that because you are not raising your voice, you are not causing harm, but your wife is bleeding. Every time you withdraw, she experiences it not as your composure, but as your abandonment. And she has spent 15 years learning to be more afraid of your silences than other women are of their husbands' screams." The husband was genuinely shaken. He had not understood this. He had genuinely believed his silence was the virtuous choice. He had confused emotional withdrawal with self-control, and the difference between the two had cost his marriage 15 years. The second person was a wife, genuinely devout, genuinely prayerful. She prayed the rosary every day. She went to daily Mass when she could. She was known in her parish as a woman of deep faith, but she had taken her suffering inside her marriage and turned it into a kind of invisible spiritual superiority. She wore her endurance like a crown. She never said anything obviously cruel to her husband, but her sighs communicated what her words did not. Her expressions of patient, martyred endurance told her husband every single day, without a single spoken sentence, that he was permanently inadequate, that she was the holier one, that she was managing him as a cross rather than loving him as a person. "You have made your suffering into a weapon," Padre Pio told her. "You do not wound with words, you wound with your holiness. And a wound delivered through holiness is the most difficult wound to heal, because the one who inflicts it genuinely does not believe herself capable of causing harm." The third person was a widow. Her husband had died 6 years earlier. She had come to confess something she had never told a living soul. She had felt relief when he died. Not joy, not celebration, but a terrible, shameful, undeniable relief. She had loved him at the beginning, but the last decade of their marriage had been a slow suffocation of two people who had stopped turning toward each other so long ago they had forgotten what turning toward each other even felt like. Padre Pio listened to her full confession without interrupting, and then he said, "You are not guilty for feeling relief. But I am asking you to sit with something. How much of that suffocation did both of you create together? How many times did you choose your pride over his heart? How many times did he choose the same? How many doors did each of you close, one at a time, until the house had no air left in it?" She wept, not from guilt, from recognition, from the particular grief of seeing clearly something you can no longer change. What Padre Pio was doing across all three of these confessions, and I want you to hear this carefully because it is one of the most important things I have ever understood about his spiritual approach to marriage. He was refusing to let any of them remain comfortable in the position of the victim, not because they were not suffering, not because their pain was not real, but because the victim position, as real and as understandable as it is, makes genuine change impossible. You cannot change a marriage from the position of the person who is only being wronged. You can only change it from the position of the person who is willing to be honest about their own contribution to the cold. Few Catholics know this, but Padre Pio had a specific teaching about marriage that he returned to repeatedly with his spiritual children. A teaching so simple and so devastating in its accuracy that it has stayed with me since the first time I read it. The greatest enemy of a Catholic marriage is not adultery. It is not poverty or sickness or temperament. It is the slow accumulation of small unforgivenesses, each one as light as a feather, each one seemingly insignificant. But they do not remain feathers. They calcify. They harden into walls, and after enough years, two people are not living together in a marriage. They are living in separate fortresses made of accumulated hurts, politely passing each other in the corridor and wondering with genuine bewilderment how they arrived at this place. This is the paradox Padre Pio revealed, the reversal that none of the couples who came to him in crisis had expected. It is almost never the dramatic failures that destroy Catholic marriages. It is the daily decision not to extend grace, not to say sorry first, not to ask how she is actually feeling rather than how her day went, not to look at him as though he is still the person you promised your life to before God. It is the slow replacement of deliberate love with mere coexistence. And it happens so gradually that by the time either person notices, they cannot identify the moment it began. Now I need to tell you about something that was recorded by one of Padre Pio's spiritual daughters, a woman who spent 17 years under his spiritual guidance and kept detailed notes of everything he shared with her. These notes were preserved in the archives of San Giovanni Rotondo, and several of the most important passages have been shared by those who had access to them. In one of her records, she writes about an evening conversation after Vespers when Padre Pio spoke to a small group about what God actually sees when he looks at a marriage in crisis. She writes, Padre Pio told us that in his mystical visions, he had been shown how God perceives a marriage that is suffering. He said, I saw the angel of their union. He was still present between them. He had not withdrawn. He was kneeling in the space between their two chairs at the dinner table, his hands raised, praying without ceasing. He had been in that position for years. He had not given up on them, even though they had given up on each other. This is what changed everything for me when I first encountered this account. The angel of the union does not leave because the humans are failing each other. The grace of the sacrament does not withdraw because there is conflict and distance and years of accumulated hurt. It remains, it kneels, it intercedes, it waits with a patience that puts human patience to shame. Padre Pio continued, according to her notes, "What I saw next was harder to bear. I saw what was blocking the grace from reaching them. It was not demonic. It was not some dramatic spiritual attack. It was a decision. A repeated, daily, almost mechanical decision by both of them to approach each other from behind their walls, to speak to the wall instead of to the heart. And grace cannot pass through walls. Grace passes through openings, and they had together sealed every opening." He paused for a moment and then said what became for his spiritual daughter one of the most important things she ever received from him. A marriage is only truly dead when both people agree, simultaneously, to stop turning toward each other. As long as one of them still turns, there is still life. I want you to hold that sentence, because it may be the most important thing in everything I am sharing with you today. As long as one of them still turns, there is still life. Now here is something that Padre Pio was absolutely clear about. Something he repeated to spiritual directors and to confessors who came to him for guidance on how to counsel married couples. When a Catholic marriage begins to die spiritually, the demonic activity around that family increases, not because demons are the cause of the marriage failing, but because the enemy is an opportunist, and a home that is divided in spirit is a home with openings. A home divided in spirit, Padre Pio said, is a home with open windows in winter. The enemy does not need to break through anything. He simply enters through the drafts created by coldness. He was specific about what this looked like in practice. Children in spiritually divided homes are more vulnerable to spiritual confusion, to a gradual loosening of their faith, to the quiet influence of voices and ideas that would have less power in a spiritually unified household, not because God abandons them, but because part of the spiritual protection that God intends to flow through a Catholic family depends on the spiritual state of the union at the center of that family. The brown scapula, the blessed crucifix over the child's bed, the holy water at the entrance, these are real protections, but they function in partnership with the spiritual atmosphere of the home. And a home where the parents are in sustained, unresolved conflict has over time a diminished spiritual atmosphere. Padre Pio was not saying this to condemn struggling couples. He was saying it to give them the full weight of what is at stake. Because he believed that when a husband and wife understood that their marriage was not only about their own happiness, but about the spiritual protection of every soul living under that roof, the motivation to fight for the marriage became something far more powerful than mere personal fulfillment. And here, after everything I have shared with you today, after the diagnosis, after the warning, after the full weight of what Padre Pio saw and knew and wept over in his confessional, we arrive at the part I most want you to receive. Because Padre Pio was not, at his core, a prophet of doom. He was a confessor, and the purpose of a confessor is not to condemn, it is to open the door. When Elena finally finished weeping in that confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo, Padre Pio said to her, something she repeated for the rest of her life, "You did not create this wound alone. You will not heal it alone. But you can begin the healing. And the beginning is always the same thing, truth, spoken gently but truth. The generational wound passes from generation to generation precisely because each generation avoids the truth, because naming it feels dangerous, because sitting across from your husband or your wife, the person who has hurt you and whom you have hurt, and saying, I think we have become strangers to each other, and I do not want that, and I am willing to do whatever it takes to change it. Requires a vulnerability that most of us have been trained since childhood to avoid. But Padre Pio promised that vulnerability is precisely the opening through which God enters, not into the polished, composed Sunday morning performance of Catholic family life, into the cracked, honest, humbled place where two people turn to each other across a table full of years of pain and choose each other again, deliberately, with open eyes, without the guarantee of an easy outcome. Elena went home. She spoke to her husband with a truth and a tenderness she had not offered him in years, perhaps ever. He did not respond immediately. He was guarded. He had built his own walls over his own years of accumulated hurt. But she kept turning. Week after week, deliberately, she chose him again. She stopped managing him and started loving him. She stopped performing Catholic endurance and started practicing Catholic honesty. After 3 months, something broke open in him, not in anger, in tears. He told her things he had never told anyone, including himself, about his father, about his silence, about the shame he had carried, about the kind of husband he had become. And they began at last to actually know each other, not the versions of each other they had been managing, the actual people beneath the walls. Their marriage did not become effortless. It did not become the romance of their early years, but it became something more valuable than either of those things. It became a genuine partnership before God, two people who had looked at the worst of themselves and of each other and chosen to stay anyway. And that, Padre Pio always said, is the truest form of love. You just received something that most Catholics spend years searching for. Not a list of rules, not a condemnation of your failures, but Padre Pio's actual spiritual diagnosis of why holy families suffer and his actual understanding of how the suffering can end. These teachings were spoken in confessionals, recorded in letters, passed from spiritual director to spiritual director, because they work, because they describe something real about the human soul and its relationship to grace. This channel exists to bring these teachings to families around the world who are sitting in exactly the kind of silence we describe today, who are wondering how they got here, who are sleeping in the same bed with a stranger and praying for something to change without knowing how to begin. Padre Pio said that those who spread divine truth are participating in the work of salvation. If this teaching reached your heart today, the super thanks button beneath this video is your way of saying that this work must continue, that these truths matter, that the families who need them deserve to find them. You are not simply a viewer of this channel. You are a guardian of these revelations. Before I close, I want to give you something you can begin tonight. Padre Pio gave specific spiritual practices to the couples and families who came to him in crisis. I have gathered the 3 most essential, the 3 he returned to most consistently across decades of pastoral work with struggling marriages. These are not theories. They are the practices of people who found their way back. The first practice, the evening question. Padre Pio taught that a marriage is a daily spiritual practice, not a legal status that operates on its own momentum. He recommended that couples develop the habit of a brief, genuine exchange at the end of each day, not a logistics review, not a scheduling conversation, a real question asked with real attention. How are you today? Not how was your day? How are you? The distinction matters enormously. How was your day asks about events. How are you asks about the person. Padre Pio believed that the marriage that asks this question faithfully every evening for 30 days will be unrecognizable from the marriage that does not. Begin tonight. Put the phone face down. Turn off whatever is on the screen. Turn to the person beside you and ask, how are you today? And then, and this is the part that requires the most courage, listen without preparing your response. The second practice, the confession of the inherited wound. This is the practice Padre Pio was most specific about, because he believed the generational wound cannot be fully broken without being named before God in the sacrament of confession. Not only the personal sins, but the pattern itself. Walk into your next confession and name what you inherited. Tell the priest, I have been repeating a pattern from my family that I want to surrender. I have been expressing love through control, or through silence, or through endurance without tenderness, and I want the grace to do otherwise. Ask for the specific grace to break the pattern in your generation. This is a legitimate, deeply Catholic request. Do not be embarrassed to make it. Padre Pio believed that a sin named in its generational dimension receives a grace proportionate to its depth. The older the wound, the more powerful the grace that meets it when it is finally brought to the light. If you do not yet know what your inherited wound is, begin with this question, the same question Padre Pio asked Eleanor. What did my father's silence teach me? What did my mother's endurance teach me? What did I absorb from the home I grew up in about what love looks and sounds and feels like? Whatever answer rises to the surface, bring it to confession. Do not analyze it first. Do not resolve it first. Bring it as it is. The third practice, the re-spoken vow. Padre Pio taught that the vow spoken before God at the altar does not expire with time and does not diminish with difficulty. But he also taught that it must be renewed in the heart, not only in the sacrament, but in the daily, deliberate act of choosing. He encouraged the couples he guided to speak their vows to each other again, privately, before a blessed crucifix, at least once each year. Not as a ceremony, not as a performance, simply as two people standing before God and saying what they still mean, what they choose to mean, what they are asking for the grace to keep meaning. I choose you, not the easier version of you, not the version of you before the years and the wounds and the walls. You as you are before God, right now. Still, if your marriage feels abstract to you right now, if you have become administrators of a shared life rather than lovers before God, if you cannot honestly remember the last time you looked at your spouse and felt something beyond the weight of history between you, then this practice is the beginning Padre Pio would prescribe. Find your blessed crucifix, stand before it, together if that is possible, alone if your spouse is not yet ready, and speak what you promised. Not because you feel it fully in this moment, but because you believe in the grace that makes feeling follow choosing, if you choose faithfully enough, long enough, with enough humility before God. Padre Pio promised this, and I have seen it with my own eyes in the testimonies of families that by any human reckoning should have ended. The grace of the marriage sacrament is inexhaustible. No couple who genuinely returns to God together, who genuinely chooses truth over comfort and vulnerability over dignity, will be left without the help they need. The door is always open, the angel is still kneeling, and the question is never whether God will help you rebuild what has been broken. The question is only whether you are willing to turn. Now I want to hear from you. Write in the comments below. Did you recognize something in what I shared today? A pattern, a silence, an inherited wound you have been carrying without a name for it. You do not need to use names. You do not need to be specific, but by naming it, even here, even in the comment section of a video, you begin to break its power over you. And your testimony may be the thing that gives someone else, sitting in silence in a cold house somewhere in the world tonight, the courage to finally turn.